I'm a little bit shorter. Watela, Dr. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield, Nashi. I want to thank everybody, especially Laura, for putting this together. I think we should give her all a huge round of applause. This is just a fantastic festival that she's organized. And to our wonderful sponsors, I'm so grateful that you feel that this is important enough to sponsor and support. So thank you. I'm so glad you're here today. I'm Dr. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield. Samantha Chisholm Hatfield wa amnashi. Shitutu dene kaalapuya Chinook Salagi. I am Chinook I am enrolled with the Confederated Tribes with the Chinook, from the Chinook to Tutni and Kalapuya bands, and I'm also Cherokee on the other side of my family. So I graduated from Oregon State University with my doctorate in environmental science, and I specialize in traditional ecological knowledge. So Laura asked me to come here and talk a little bit about how TEK works into the beavers and how important our beavers are. And I'm going to get a little bit more into that as we go along. First of all, I want to tell you what TEK is and how it works in our communities. A lot of times in our Native communities, we don't call it TEK. We call it something else, just ways of knowing or, talking about what we do as Indian people. We really have a specialized indigenous science process where we integrate that information into our families, into our social systems, into how we engineer things. You'll see this wonderful carving over here, and all of those processes involve TEK and highly specialized TEK. That's not just a basic knowledge system. You have to really understand how to get the wood, when the time is to get the wood, the phenology aspect of seasonality, how to carve the wood, how the grain works, which woods are correct to get. So all of those things fall under TEK, and people assume that it's just this science-only aspect. But TEK is more than that. It's very integrated. It's very enveloped in everything we do. Arts and science and community. So it's a very holistic process. So my primary work works with Oregon Climate Change Research Institute at Oregon State University. Oregon Climate Change Institute, or OCRI, is a state program that one of the governors back in the 90s set up, and we work as sort of like a clearinghouse. We look at different aspects of climate change impacts. We look at how things are moving along. We look at different reports. We do different reports. We do research projects. And my role is to go out into communities and look at how climate change is impacting Native peoples. And so I work into tribes and I look at how that impacts and how we can mitigate those, how adaptations are happening, and the responses of those impacts. And so it's really important to keep in mind that not everything can be taken out of a environment or an ecosystem and taken back to the lab and put under the microscope or grown. And that's not how TEK works. So my job is to look at it in its environment, in that holistic aspect, and then come back and report that in a way that other non-native scientists or other community members can understand it and then have that applied into management or policy. So it's really an important facet of what we do and how we serve the Native American community and how we serve Greater Oregon. So one of the things that is most important about TEK is that it's important to know that we're land-based people. Native tribes are tied to the land. So it's not as easy for us as Native people to say, well, I think I want to move. I'm just going to I think I'm going to move to Massachusetts. I think that's a nice state and I'm just going to go. So one of those things that is allowed for many non-native people to have that flexibility in our community, in our cultures, we are tied to the lands where we are. We have a very close relationship to what we do, how we pray, our religious ceremonies, and our kinship with the land. We also have a responsibility. So when somebody says, well, I'm just going to move, oftentimes Native people don't have that opportunity. They have to fulfill a responsibility to continue those ceremonies, take care of plant and animal beings that we consider our relatives. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind when people say, well, climate change is happening, why don't you just move? Move north, move south, move. We don't have that opportunity. Some of our ceremonies are really based in place, and we can only do those ceremonies in that place. So it's very vital to keep in mind that this place is a sacred place. It's a sacred being in and of itself, along with the peoples, be it animal, plant, or human. So there are different types of ecological knowledges. I study traditional ecological knowledge, and TEK is often thought of as being linked to Native people. And people often think, oh, that's Native, that's a Native thing. And that's very true. But there are different aspects and different levels of ecological knowledges. Like there is a fisherman's ecological knowledge, and there are groups of people that work with fishermen, commercial, local, any kind of, large agency. Those fishermen that have been doing that for a couple generations know, how to look for weather, how to read the sea, how to do some of those things that relate specifically to fishing. And so that's one type. Another type that you're probably more aware of is farmers' ecological knowledge. And farmers' ecological knowledge can be seen in the Farmer's Almanac, and that's been going around for a long time. The difference between those other ecological knowledges and traditional ecological knowledge is that traditional ecological knowledge is 3 or more generations, and it's not unheard of to have 7 generations worth of knowledge passed down. And most of that information is an oral data system. So when you hear the word story, for Native people, it's not a story like Disney or, Brothers Grimm. It's story in the aspect that it's an information data system that is orally transmitted and has been in recent times documented. But we have a different system for that transmission, and most of it is oral. And you're going to hear one of our absolute wonderful experts here in TEK. Very soon you're just going to have the pleasure of just diving into what he does in a wonderful way. So I can't wait to get to hear him again. It is just fantastic. So these long-term trends are really important. I know that a lot of people are talking about citizen science and how important that is, and it is. And that can be paired with traditional ecological knowledge, and traditional ecological knowledge can be paired with Western science as well. It fills in the gaps of things that aren't explained well or that scientists can't explain through Western science, such as when they bring a species or an aspect into the lab and they can't explain some of those components of why it does this or what's going on here. They just know one piece of it. That holistic nature of TEK can then fill in those gaps. That's a really big component of how we can look to Indigenous science to help us figure out problems in our local, in our regional, and in our bigger global environment. So one of the things that's really important about our beaver is that he's a keystone, she's a keystone species. And a keystone species, if you're not aware of that, they're like an arch. They're the apex. So if you take out that keystone species, that arch crumbles. And it's going to not be able to hold up. And all of those other species that rely on that apex species keeping everything in place are going to be kind of floundering. They don't know how to work around what is going to happen next. Who's the other apex that can fill that spot? There really isn't any. So it's really important to think about who and why that piece is in place and how that arch really supports everything else, because that's a really key component. A lot of times people don't think about that. They just think of everything as individual and coexisting. But everything is in a circle, and if you take a piece of that circle out, it's no longer a circle. So we have what is called in TEK marker or indicator species. And that's kind of like a keystone species, but it's also something that works very independently within that TEK system. So beaver is one of our indicator species or our marker species. When beaver does something, we pay attention to it because all of the other species rely on that and respond. So beaver is very integral to our knowing and our facilitating all of this knowledge. It's important to watch what beaver does and how beaver is telling us what is going on in our environments. It can be as simple as, wow, the river's too low right now, or wow, it's, dry as it is right now. But the other species also will respond to beaver and look to beaver to see what beaver is doing and how beaver is responding. So even the tiniest little minnows in river systems, or trees and brush, how is that being cleared? All of those species are watching because beaver is that keystone, that marker species that's taking the lead in those behaviors. And so when Native people employ TEK, they go out and they will say, well, gosh, beaver did this, or that beaver lodge has been moved, or they've taken this tree down where they've never been in that aspect before, or they've moved north. Migration of species is one of the key things that climate change issues are looking at, and movement and migration of species is really key. So when all of those little other species are looking to beaver to say, hey, what are we going to do? Where are you leading us? They're going to move along with him or her. So Native communities look to those aspects of what beaver does and who beaver is and what beaver's doing. How does their lodge look? Is it small? Did they have offspring? Where are they taking the resources from? What is going on? It's a really big part of knowing that phenology or that seasonality and how the seasons are progressing. But on a lower level, it's also how things are moving and how things are progressing in that environment. What is going on? How to respond? How are we looking at these things? It's a big part of continuance and being able to continue in all of these TEK aspects. Sometimes it's as large as even knowing when to go fishing. What is beaver doing? Is the water clear? Beaver, you might probably have heard of the phrase water is life and the really big focus on water cleanliness and access, and the drought has heightened that in a really big way. But beaver is that indicator species of how those streams are doing, how those lakes are doing, how all of those terrestrial systems and all of those areas, those thoroughfares, how is that going on? It's not just the water, it's all of the aspects that contribute to the water as well. And in Western science, some of that kind of gets played by the wayside sometimes. Media focuses on one aspect. It's just the water clarity, or it's just the water turbidity, or it's the water temperature. But it's really important to look at all of the factors, because water doesn't just stand alone, and there isn't any natural resource or species that stands alone. We're all in a circle together, and that includes all of us. Beaver can also indicate how the pollution levels are. If it's too polluted in one area or there's runoff that we can't see, beaver will move. And so that's a really good indicator to say, hey, oh my gosh, we better look at this water because it looks clear and everything looks fine, but what's going on? Because beaver's gone and all of these other species are moving with it. They don't want the arch to collapse. They want to stay where they're at, and they want to make their systems as wonderful home as we do. What would happen if your toilet, backed up and you couldn't use one toilet and wow, what's going on? I can't see anything. You'd bring in, people to look, right? So that's one of the things that TEK can show us, because we watch beaver and we watch how he's moving and what he's doing. I keep wanting to make beaver a him. I'm sorry, beaver. Maybe I should say they. So we have a great reverence for water systems, and beaver is one of those beings that's attached to water systems because they are so keen to what the water is doing and how the water is moving and what's going on. It's really an aspect of showing how the biodiversity is working, and they can really enrich that biodiversity because they've got such powerful ways of connection, being that apex predator, or not predator, but apex species. They really have that ability to know how to move things and which to take from, which trees to take from, which plants to take from, which mud systems to take from, and they really foster that in a really way that allows our water systems to thrive and builds healthy ecosystems. So beaver is a really good regulator of biodiversity system and healthy ecosystems. So that's really important that we honor that beaver in ways that we don't usually. People think of beaver as cute and funny and, oh, that's so cute, and they don't realize the powerful role that beaver plays in, especially here in the Northwest. We are really prideful of our waterways and our clean air and our wonderful green aspects. And people think, oh, that just happens and we just need to not litter. But beaver is one of the key parts of why our Northwest here is so green and so clean, and how it's kept that way. Unfortunately, beaver was prized for his pelt, their pelt, and their fur. It has been really cherished for a long time, and their numbers went down significantly. But he's building back up, just slowly, but we're getting there. It's really important to keep that going and keep their numbers thriving, so that we can keep those healthy ecosystems, because that's a really big part of who we are here in the Northwest, and keeping that health going. Those healthy ecosystems will help combat the climate change impacts that we are feeling already. So that's a really nice way to look at, wow, what can I do? I feel so helpless. I frequently encounter people who ask me, well, what can I do? You have all of this knowledge. What can I do? I'm just one person and I'm not native. You can support things like this festival, or aspects of the environment. Cleanup efforts are great, but supporting the species and those keystone species, such as beaver, is a really big part of that. So, fighting with my things. So beavers play a really integrated role in our societies, our native societies, as well as our local ecosystems and our communities, even if we don't see them. A lot of times you will not know that beaver is there because they're so efficient, they're so tremendously good at what they do, and you can just appreciate the aspects that they bring about, the after effects, if you will. So it's really important to keep in mind that those that you don't see are just important as those that you do see, and sometimes more so. So with that, I'm open to any questions. If you want to have any questions, if you have anything that you want to ask or discuss. I appreciate you being here. Yes?
Thank you so much. Are there organizations locally or anywhere in Oregon that are specifically aimed at protecting the beaver? I have read something about that.
Yeah, I don't know any specific, and I could not, vouch for one, being in the role I am, but I would look that up. I know that there are different like wildlife federations and anything that you can do to help like restore watershed councils would be a good place to start. And then recovery and rehabilitation. I know that there's rehabilitation programs for beaver, and so that would be fantastic to support as well. Even if it's just spreading the word, every little bit helps. Well, thank you for being here. I think at this point I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Ed Edmo. You have another question? Sorry. I'm not aware or involved with any legislation, but I think that would be a fantastic idea. Yeah. Pardon?
What's your favorite beaver story?
My favorite beaver story is those that Ed tells. And I'm going to let him tell those because he's fantastic. So in our communities, our elders are the TEK experts. Those of us who work in the TEK field are only called specialists because we do not have the length of time and those generations embedded yet. TEK is a practice that is very enacted. It's utilized and applied. And so that application and utilization are things that our elder experts have. And so sometimes we just defer to them because they are the experts. Yeah. Thank you so much. I cannot wait to hear you.